Forgiveness is an outward act of love. I had a ministry called Saving Grace and was privileged to found it in 1999, and we work with ex-offenders. Similarly, we work with law enforcement agencies all over Western New York to reach and to help guide our offenders to a better life. No matter what their background was, no matter what their criminal history was, it didn't matter. Our biblical mandate, our duty was to love you, was to support you, and was to accept you. And oftentimes, that became very challenging because some of the people we serve committed some awful, horrific crimes. And yet Jesus was there saying, love them as I loved you. And as an ex-offender myself, I know the power of the gospel to change and touch a life. And as these protests and as the incidents unfolded, and a number of the unjust shootings had occurred, wrongful shootings, it was a heavy burden to understand what can we do? How can we act differently? I was beginning to feel pressure from individuals in my life as a leader, ministry leader, that were asking me to take a stand one side or another. Either I had to back the blue or I had to take a stand to support Black Lives Matter, and you couldn't be on one side or the other. And that was in my world where people loved Jesus. And yet I was being asked to take a firm stand, and I knew in my heart that my stand had to be with Christ. And similarly, I was being asked by a local pastor at the same time, who he and I had conversed, and we were talking a number of phone calls where he too was receiving correspondence and emails and being requested to take one side over another. And so I knew that in the season of divide and division and the rhetoric that we were hearing, where did Christ want us to be in all this? And what role did the church have? And what was the message that we had one to another? And that's the lens that really was allowing me to be receptive to the call from the local pastor when it came to say, hey, what do you think about having offenders and law enforcement come together and pray? And as I thought about it, I said, at the foot of the cross is where Christ wants us to be. I knew that there was a struggle because parolees, by the nature of their release conditions, are told not to fraternize with, not to engage with, not to be in the presence with of law enforcement. On the other hand, you have law enforcement that culturally, we've experienced, diminishes the value of offenders. There are those in the oversight that look at parolees as less than. And so the sheer notion that offenders and law enforcement could come together and be in the room and pray, unheard of. We didn't know what to expect, but then as the days got closer, I was receiving some text messages that said, will there be protesters? Will there be others? Is this political? Are we being set up? And all of this was going through one's minds, and I thought to myself, this is a reality of where life has brought us all. And surprisingly, there were many parolees that attended and law enforcement officers from various agencies from as far as Syracuse, from Homeland Security, FBI, Buffalo Police Department, Erie County Sheriff's, and the offenders came in, and church members came in. And I remember looking around the room and feeling a special godly presence that evening that said, this is a miracle. This is a miracle that we're able to meet. Not just celebrate and worship together, but be willing to be in the same room, one to another. And no one knew who was law enforcement and who was parolees because we all came in our normal clothes. There were no titles, no badges, just people that said, we love Jesus and we want to experience whatever he has for us this night. I asked everyone if they would to do something a bit unconventional, put their chairs in a circle, and so we could look at each other eye to eye, and not someone's back head or someone's side. This wasn't an NA group or an AA group, and man, this was just about us being vulnerable. And as I sat back quietly, a police officer, he identified himself as a police officer, and Officer Ritchie, he began to share the burden on his heart. And There would not a dry eye in the room.
As a police officer, back in 2003, I was shot on the job by an individual who had AK-47. I was shot in the chest, both my legs, and my face. Took 2 years of recovery. My right arm was paralyzed. My right leg had almost been blown off. So the doctors did their part, and the rest was up to God to do his healing.
And then he forgave the person that shot him. He forgave him. And I looked around and I saw other parolees weeping and just tearing up.
As I'm telling my story, just sitting over to the right of me about 6 feet is a gentleman. He's sobbing, he's crying. He spent 42 years in prison for killing a police officer here in Erie County back 42 years ago. Just released out of prison about 3 weeks before this meeting. Became very emotional, very remorseful for what he did.
As he told the story, the law enforcement community all began to forgive him, one to another to another.
That night, I made a new friend, and my friend is a person who murdered a police officer 42 years ago, but he is a brother in Christ. Nobody in that room isn't better than anybody else.
There is a man weeping, seeking and being forgiven. And then others began to share and ask for forgiveness and be forgiven and find joy and a peace that they had never felt, even though they had given their life to the Lord. By publicly asking and claiming forgiveness and being forgiven by the act one to another, it was a moment that I will always understand of what the possibilities of the Church of Jesus Christ can be to a hurting world.
Christ forgives us for no matter what we do. The very least is we have to try to be like him.
We accept you for who you've become today, not who you once were in Christ. That's forgiveness, and that comes out of a place of love.